The tyranny of the mask. Leon County, in my adopted state of Florida, has mandated the wearing of face coverings in indoor public spaces. There are numerous exceptions to the requirement, such as while exercising, at a distance of course, and for health reasons. Those who violate the ordinance face an initial $50 fine, which increases to $125 and then up to $250. As would be expected, this ordinance has been met with some resistance. For example, there have been posts on social media encouraging businesses to post signs that encourage people to, perhaps dishonestly, use a health exception to avoid wearing masks. As would be expected, this has been labeled as tyranny, the wearing of masks, not the, dishonest exceptions. This provides an excellent context in which to discuss tyranny and liberty. One obvious challenge in discussing whether imposing a mask requirement is tyrannical is agreeing on a serious definition of tyranny that is more than something I don't like. Since American political philosophy is based heavily on our good dead friend John Locke, he's my usual go-to for defining this term. Locke takes tyranny to be the exercise of power beyond right. For him, the right use of power is for the good of the citizens, and a leader's use of power for his own private advantage is exercising that power beyond right. Locke also presents some other key points about tyranny, noting that it occurs when the governor, however entitled, makes his will and not the law the rule, does not direct his commands and actions to the preservation of the properties of his people, and directs them to the satisfaction of his own ambition, revenge, covetousness, or any other irregular passion. So then the obvious question is the ordinance tyrannical? Does this ordinance, and similar impositions, to make it a general point, not just something that's happening in Leon County, Florida, does this meet the definition? Does imposing things like masks on people, does that constitute tyranny? On the face of it, it does not. After all, the aim of this ordinance and similar, requirements seems to clearly be for the good of the citizens. It's aimed at reducing the chances that people will get infected. It is also aimed at allowing businesses and other public places to operate. On the, the reasoning that if people are wearing masks, they can be in these public places safer. That is to say, it's aimed at the preservation of the properties of the people in terms of keeping, say, businesses going while still trying to be somewhat safe. So there is also no evidence that those in office are using this ordinance for their own private separate advantage or trying to satisfy some irregular passion. Now, if there was evidence for this, if they were up to something, say they secretly had stock in, mask companies and were, making a fortune selling masks to people that they now require, or they had some sort of irregular passion, they just wanted to shove people around and crush liberty. In that case, if that was proven with some actual evidence, then this would change matters. Then it could become tyranny. But again, on the face of it, none of that seems to be the case. Now, it could be argued that while the objectives of the ordinance are not tyrannical itself, because it's aimed at the good of the people and not some sort of, private advantage, etc., it could be argued that the ordinance involves exercising power beyond right. That is, the ordinance oversteps the legitimate limits of the power of the governing body. It goes too far. Since I'm not a lawyer, I will not let the legal aspect of this matter be addressed by me. Rather, I'll let people who are legal experts comment on that, which is a separate matter. Is this legally okay? And that's a matter for lawyers and judges to settle. Instead, I'll focus on the area where I'm an expert, namely the moral expert aspect of it. So do authorities have the moral right to impose a mask requirement on the people? Now, while people tend to answer such questions in terms of their likes and dislikes, I'll follow J.S. Mill and make use of principles that I consistently apply in cases of liberty versus safety, or liberty versus security, as typically presented. As in all such cases, my first area of inquiry is into the effectiveness of the efforts at safety and security. After all, if we're giving up liberty to gain nothing, this would be both foolish and wrong. While there is some debate over the effectiveness of masks, the consensus of experts is that they do help prevent the spread of the virus. There is also the intuitively plausible argument that face coverings will reduce the spread of the virus because they help reduce the volume and distance of expulsions, as well as helping block some of what is incoming when you breathe. Wearing a mask, of course, is not without its costs. Aside from the possible cost of buying or making masks, they're uncomfortable to wear, they interfere with conversations, and of course it's hard to look good in a mask. Although maybe in some cases one might look better in a mask. So while breathing does require a bit more effort, this is generally not a significant factor for most people. Those with pre-existing conditions impacting their breathing are more likely to be severely impacted by the virus. So they'll need to rationally weigh the relative risks versus, putting up against the discomfort of wearing the mask against the likelihood of being infected and difficulty with breathing. Now, anecdotally, I don't find the mask problematic, but I used to run wearing a face mask during the Maine winters back when I lived in Maine, so perhaps I mastered mask breathing long ago. But I certainly do admit that they're not pleasant to wear, and obviously I and pretty much everyone else will stop wearing them when we don't have to wear them. Now, weighing the effectiveness of the mask against the harms, they seem to have a clear safety advantage. By enduring some minor discomfort for short periods of time, you can reduce your risk of being infected with a potentially lethal disease. You also reduce the risk of infecting others if you are already infected. So the second issue to address is whether the gain in safety warrants the imposition on liberty. After all, some people do not want to wear a mask, and it is an imposition to require this under the threat of punishment. A good guide to liberty is a principle of harm presented by John Stuart Mill. Now, our good dead friend John Stuart Mill contends that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. I will rely on Mill's arguments for his principle, but certainly agree that his principle can be criticized and alternative principles can be advanced. So not simply assuming this, I'm relying on his arguments and accepting that this can be clearly debated. So getting back to the principle, during the discussion of the principle, Mill argues that we, collectively, have no right to infringe on a person's liberty because doing so would be good for them or even to prevent them from harming themselves. As long as their actions impact only themselves, their liberty is absolute. So applying this to the masks, if they only served to protect a person from infection, that is, they only protected the wearer, then Mill's principle would forbid the imposition of masks. Why? Well, on Mill's view, and my own view because I accept this view, people have a liberty of self-harm. So if this were the case, if masks only protected the wearer, I would agree with those who see the mask impositions as tyranny. They have a moral right to put themselves at risk if doing so does not harm others. As people say, their body, their choice. To use an analogy, suppose I want to go shooting without wearing any eye or hearing protection, and I've got medical insurance to cover, anything that might happen to me, so I'm not imposing the cost on others. I have a right to be stupid and risk losing an eye, risk damaging my hearing. So, in that case, I have a right to do stupid, harmful stuff to myself. Likewise, if all there was to mask wearing was protecting the wearer, then I would agree. People have a right to make bad choices and hurt themselves. It's irrational, but it is a moral right people have and should have. But the masks do more than just protect the wearer. They also protect other people. If I go out without a mask and I am unaware that I'm infected, I'm putting other people in greater danger. I am potentially harming them. As such, it is no longer just my business, it is their business as well. Going back to the gun analogy, I do not have a right to fire my gun around the range whenever and wherever I want. Doing so puts other people at risk of injury and death, and I can be rightfully prevented from doing so. To use another analogy, while I do think a person has the moral right to turn off their airbag in their car and thus face a greater risk of injury or death themselves, they do not have the right to drive without brakes. They're now putting everyone at risk. The obvious conclusion is that the imposition of masks is not tyranny. In fact, it is an excellent example of how the state should exercise its power, which is for the protection of the citizens on the basis of the best available evidence.